To give you a sense of Nasser's voice, I'll read from a chapter that's entitled, Have You Ever Informed a Prisoner of His Mother's Death? This will be about a 3-minute reading. At 7 in the evening on Wednesday, the third day of Ramadan in the year 2019, we received news from the Red Cross that the mother of a prisoner named Kamal had passed. The other souls wanted me to accompany them to Kamal's cell to break the terrible news. We waited for the call for the evening prayer in order to allow him to break his fast and ease his hunger and thirst. Then we entered his cell. An hour later, we were back. Have you ever informed a prisoner of his mother's death? I have, and it wasn't the first time. After waiting for Kamal to finish his iftar, we entered his cell feeling embarrassed and ashamed, much as the angels of death must have felt when they burst in upon his mother's bed. Kamal's mother had resisted her visitors. She slammed the door in their faces, yet they insisted. She asked for more time, just until her next visit to the prison. Allow me one last Eid, she said, looking into the angel's eyes. Kamal has asked for some clothes, and I haven't had time to get them yet. Come back next month. Kamal hates it when I'm slow with his requests, and I couldn't bear to keep him waiting. Come back next month. On my last visit, I forgot to memorize all the changes etched upon his face by 14 years of iron. Come back in a month. Let me express my love one last time. Give me time to pray that he'll only weep for me a short time. The angels of death covered her face and ended her life quickly, fearing that they might waver in their mission. We entered Kamal's cell. We covered our faces so he would not see them in the funeral procession of his mother. We sat down without saying a word. Kamal finished washing the dishes. He sat beside me and asked about my health. The covered faces began to utter brief generalizations about the inevitability of death. Their talk became more specific and urged Kamal to be steadfast and strong. He looked at them in surprise as they went on speaking. Who was it? Kamal asked me. Your mother, I replied, without any hesitation. Despite my embarrassment, I didn't cover my face. I didn't wait for another month or some future visit. Your clothes came too late, Kamal. There will be no Eid to end your long fast of iron. Kamal covered his face, but not out of shame or embarrassment. He clutched the iron bars and buried his face between his hands. He cried until he choked on his sobs, and his face wet the iron. We spoke to him about a merciful Lord who had taken his mother 1 hour ago. I don't think Kamal heard what we said. Mama, Kamal kept crying out to his mother as he embraced the iron bars. Have you ever informed a prisoner of his mother's death? I have, and it won't be the last time. Be gentle, O angel of death. I swear you've taken nothing more dear to us than this. Be gentle, O angel of death. Come gently. Blessed be the one taking. Blessed be the one taken. Thank you. And maybe with that, I want to invite Ammiel to unmute and share some of your thoughts, Ammiel,
I'll
about.
unmute. Thank
Yeah.
you, Luke, for that reading and introduction. I just want to, as I said, I have a lot to say. I'm trying to keep it very short and get into the conversation. But I myself have been involved in Palestinian issues for, I don't know, close to 45 years, and particularly issues having to do with prisoners. And I think this may sound shocking to some people, but the objective of the October 7th attack as a military strategic objective was to take hostages in order to free prisoners and also to put the issue of Palestine back on the table as it had been removed from the world scene. Now, what we have witnessed since then is apocalyptic and momentous at the same time, apocalyptic in levels of destruction and cruelty that have been live streamed in ways that are unimaginable. Um, and the events of the last 3 or 4 days with the human march of return, which is the first time that Palestinians are returning to a place, even though it is already a place of displacement for many of them already, who come from, the 1948 borders, from Jaffa, from Majdal, from places near Gaza. At the same time, we're seeing the release of prisoners and the incredibly moving things that they say. For instance, one of the Mohammed al-Arda, one of the prisoners, who he said, if you gathered all the poems, elegies, proverbs, and sayings of the land, they would not do justice to Gaza. Another released prisoner said, our freedom was paid for by the blood of the martyrs of Gaza. We owe them a debt that can never be repaid. These are extraordinary feelings and statements, and they also have a lot to do with the poetics of Arabic, which traditionally have to do with trying to say the unsayable and trying to, as Al-Jurjani, an early medieval critic, said, finding the meaning of the meaning. And so when we look at Nasser Abu Srour's book, it's really an extraordinary book because it's also an intertext. It fits in like a piece of the puzzle of Palestinian history, of recent Palestinian history, of Palestinian writing. And it is a very bold intervention in many ways. It's a very dramatic. Luke, in your introduction, you talked about, that it doesn't really fit any genre. And that's where I kind of want to start, because one of the things that the literature of incarceration, one of its hallmarks is the fact that people in this situation may write about their circumstances, but have doubt that people will even believe it. So that it has become the writing of imprisoned people from particularly from the region. It's Palestine, Syria, Morocco, Lebanon, Iraq. People are Egypt. People are stretching experimental forms in order to find some form that will be able to express the unbelievability of their condition. And I think this is really a very very dramatically presented in the Tale of a Wall. So maybe, Luke, you could start by walking us through that a bit, and how you as a translator encountered that text and how you began to work with it.
Thanks for that question, Ammiel, and also those reflections about the incredibly horrendous things that we're seeing in the news, and we have been for this past so many months. The idea of Nasser, trying to capture his experience in prison and to share that and present that, to get it out of the walls where he was in prison, which is an incredible story in itself of how this book came to the publisher. It's a really interesting one to think about, and I think he does it. He attempts to do it by breaking these genres, by approaching the question from multiple ways. The passage I read at the beginning is an example of some of the kind of emotional writing that comes up. That doesn't characterize the whole thing. There are these passages that are extremely moving and very detailed. The one that I just read, another one with the first visit of his family who come to him in prison, and what it was like to reconnect with them through these small iron squares where you can embrace each other's fingers or share half of a kiss, or what it was like for Palestinian women to be incarcerated and then give birth in prison to a child and have their baby with them for 1 year, only for that baby to be taken away at the end of a year. They're incredibly powerful and moving pieces. Um, and then in other passages, it's very analytical when he's thinking about the history or a certain event or expressing criticism of the Palestinian leadership. Um, Other parts, he will use a poem without any real introduction. He just jumps into a poem and you see a different expression of his experience there. Um, and I think that is partly why the second half of the book fits in and works so well, despite this, extreme difference in genre, which feels a bit abrupt. Uh,
Hmm.
but then actually, by seeing his experience through the eyes of this lawyer who comes to visit him, it's one more way to show the pain of what it is for him and what it is for those who love him, and the separation that prison entails.
Yeah, I mean, in a curious way, that whole section. I've read the book 3 times now. The first time, I thought, "Wow, this is not really that plausible." And then the second time I read it, and I thought, "Oh, this is completely a metaphor for the situation and how to stay autonomous in that situation, how to maintain some liberatory space." And then the third time I read it, after our conversation, I said, "Oh, this might actually have some relationship to reality," and that made it even, in a way, more mysterious, because I mean, two immediate texts, major texts that come up when I first read this is Journal of an Ordinary Grief by Mahmoud Darwish and Darwish's Dhakirat an-Nisyan, the Memory for Forgetfulness, and which also go in and out of genre, have a lot of commentary. The big difference, and what I think sets this apart, is, as Nasser says, when he talks about his generation, a generation that would grant us the best title we had ever borne, the generation of stones. When he talks about his participation in the Intifada, um, there's something that Yahya Sinwar, in his will, said: "My will to you all begins here, from the boy who threw the first stone at the occupier and learned that stones are the first words with which one can make our voice heard." So there is something very different about this generation of stones who have to place themselves in a different light than what came before them. And I think the passages about growing up in the camp and about his father are extraordinary in many ways very revolutionary, I think, in terms of opening a space for those emotions and those experiences to be recorded within the context that he's in. I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, the what comes to mind is the like the perceptiveness of Nasser, how sensitive he is, um, how how much he questions what he sees and what he's experiencing and his place in it, and then what he observes. You see that in his interactions with the other prisoners in jail, but then going back to his youth and what it was like. You mentioned his father, for instance, and all the changes that happened when um, Palestinians were uprooted from their traditional way of life and had to create these imitation cities, these refugee camps, and people who had um, grown up working the land, that way of life was taken away from them. And so seeing how that crushed the soul of his father,
Mhm.
and at the same time elevated the power of his mother and brought out all of her strengths at managing a household and keeping people fed. Um, it's it's a really moving story. And then you also see him and the way he describes outgrowing the paths of the refugee camp and asking questions about what is different about us and the people on the other side of this imaginary line. And he starts exploring and starts going out and encountering uh,
Mhm.
the Jewish people around them. It's very moving and powerful.
Yeah. I want to I want to turn a little bit more to questions of translation and generally speaking, this also may seem like an odd thing, but um, I've had the feeling that our American English is really suffering, and I would say a lot of the Western languages that are participating in the international rules-based order and everything that goes along with it are suffering from, language that has been propagandized and is kind of inert. And I feel that translation has become a place where we can find spaces of liberation, where we can find other things. And it comes back to there's an extraordinary passage in the official 9/11 Commission report that talks about the need to bureaucratize imagination. And it's something that nobody has commented on, I think, besides me. I've written about it, and it strikes me even more so in this light of thinking about translation and thinking about particularly translating a text like this, which is it's not an easy text, I think, for somebody. It has an immediate impact, but it's filled with detail. It's historically incredibly accurate in terms of politics, in terms of the prisoner movement, the hunger strikes. It's very precise. And as I said, it really fits in the Palestinians' larger story as a key component, I think. So I think it can be read on several different levels. One can read it for its immediate impact, and then one can, as I did for the third time, start to see exactly how intertwined it is. So I'm wondering if you can say something about where you looked for your English in translating this.
Um, that's a really great question. And coming from a writer and a translator, and somebody so involved as you are, this it makes sense that that you would ask that. And um, the I think as a translator, it took a while for me to understand that my role, that I was also a writer. Maybe in my early years as a translator, I thought I was just interpreting something and capturing it. And then I think it took a while for me to realize how creative the work is to translate literature from one language to another, because there's no right answer. There's no one way it can be done. And of course, it begins with interpretation. Text, it's not always clear, and there can be debate about what it means. So how do you, and sometimes it's intentionally ambiguous. And so how do you bring that across? And then these questions of how do you know, create something that is both all my own words, but then plausibly Nasser's voice, not Luke's voice, or not solely Luke's voice.
Right, right.
Uh, I think being guided by the text, that's the first place to start. And there is when you spend enough time with an original source, you start to feel it, and you start to imagine how it could exist in English. And so being open to that, I think, is the first place to start.
At what point did you feel like your voice and his voice were moving in different directions and you needed to find him if that happened?
Yeah. The I think maybe the place where maybe I'll start by mentioning a moment of intersection.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
in the summer of 2022, I heard from uh, other press, and they said they were interested in publishing this book, and would I care to make a sample, um, or you'd be interested in the project, and could I write a sample? And so I started looking through it, and I was intrigued by many aspects of it. And I think the sample that I selected or started translating was a part that felt very natural. I think some of these introspective questions. There's an early chapter. It helped that it was a shorter chapter. Um, but then, this chapter called Questions. Tell me what you'll fight for, and I'll tell you who you are. What is it that disturbs your sleep? What dreams startle you awake in the morning? What brings a tear to your eye? Are you anxious when the rains come late? How do you make love? Or do you prefer a more explicit form of the question? Upon whose breast do you lay your head when your mother has unexpectedly passed? Does talking to the mirror annoy you? Do you jump when you see your own shadow? And he goes on. And um, I could, just imagine the kind of person who says this. I can imagine myself saying this, and there's this kind of identification.
Mhm.
The There are other parts where um, the one challenge with this book is Nasser's style. Um, it expands and expands and expands,
Right.
and there were times when I was worried that I could not, in English, capture it all in a way that would still move the book forward and um, keep the readers, just based on how we read these days and kind of various other challenges of
Mhm.
of the book. And so there were places where I did some editing and compressing, or if Nasser gives 3 or 4 examples, maybe I'll take one of those off. And or um, and so there's an open question of have I preserved Nasser's voice fully? I think being able to send him, being able to get a version of the manuscript to him, and getting him to sign off on it, that was very important. And then also hearing from some of his friends and family who read the translation and felt it and say that this in
Yeah.
English feels like
Yeah.
Nasser in Arabic.
That's amazing. Yeah, there were three particular sections that there's two of them appear as poems. The other one doesn't appear as a poem, but it all feels like a poem. Where it's the repetition of interrogation block. The interrogation block is it goes on for about a page and a half, and then there's prison is, prison is, prison is, and then there's the October section, and there's a lot of refrain in throughout. There's a lot of refrain, and I'm just wondering, in your own immersion in the text, did you find resonances with other things? Were you moved to say, oh, I better look at this, I better read this, I better think about that, or did you just keep moving?
I think that's yeah, a great question. I think, there are a couple kinds of movement that did happen. Um, the movement for research, um, not as much to other published literature. I wish, thinking back, there'd be some fascinating things things I could read that would maybe inform how I articulate Nasser's voice. I think a lot of that happens subconsciously,
Mhm.
drawing upon a lifetime of reading and maybe more reading that I did when I was younger, given how busy life becomes and there's never enough time. Um, but there was definitely research that was necessary, looking up when he talks about hunger strikes,
Yeah,
looking up and seeing how accurate he is in
yeah.
describing the hunger strikes and the things that they achieved, or when he's talking about this a reinvigorated attempt in 2013 to try to have a peace deal, all the stages of that and the various um, prisoners that were released, or the stalling of the negotiations and the breakdown, and just seeing how accurate that was, and then also helpful to get the language right when I translate it. The other kind of movement as a translator is kind of back and forth in a text. Um, the um, Certain sections, become hard or challenging or tiring or maybe emotional, and then you can take a break and go for some of the lighter hearted conversation, for instance, and then come back.
Hmm.
Um, and then as well as you get through a text and learn more about the meaning, then I come back and fine tune, either correct something that I realized I misunderstood earlier, or fine tune the language and the way I'm hearing Nasser's voice.
Hmm. Just say one more thing before we ask Judith to come on. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the work of Walid Daka, who was basically left to die from, not being let his cancer to be treated in April of 2024. Uh, it's striking to me how parallel their conception of inside and outside is the prison system and the right now, for instance, there's 900 checkpoints in the West Bank. So people can't even get out of their houses, and I find that the discourse that passes for even radical, whether it's settler colonialism or apartheid, doesn't even come close to describing what the reality is. And I think a text like this is enormously illuminating in that sense, because Nasser is also trying to liberate his own mind, in the process of being incarcerated. And so, for instance, that whole process where I think it's a 7-year period where he talks about being a jahili, reading pre-Islamic poetry and losing his faith, and it is extraordinary, and then kind of moving back towards different language usage and different references and that kind of thing. So, I think you've done a great service to get this book out, um, for its for all of its characteristics and value.
Thank you so much for saying that, Ammiel. It really means a lot, and I appreciate your reflections as well about what Nasser is doing and some of these connections and places to continue exploring, continue reading. Maybe I'll just comment on this, the point about like finding liberatory spaces that you've referred to, and the project that Nasser has through his writing to do that. And maybe it's also useful for the audience to know the tale of a wall. Um, it's not, as one might initially thinking about the apartheid wall that separates the West Bank from
Right.
Israel, but um, Nasser is thinking about the wall of his prison cell
Yeah.
and how that, in all the chaos of life in prison, becomes a source of stability. He turns the thing that binds him and holds him into an edifice upon which he can start imagining the world and creatively engaging with it, kind of somehow separating his body and living through his spirit.
Yeah. And there's one line where he says, and I besides farewell to the world, but he said, I decided to live where I am, which is in next to that wall.
Mhm.
And yeah, it's quite something. Yeah. So
Well,
shall we ask Judith to join us?
that sounds great. We
Yeah.
will, we'll be taking questions, as Pierce said. So feel free to put questions into the question box, and we'll be able to address some of those in a little bit. But first, we're so grateful that Judith could be with us this evening. Um, Judith has been incredibly involved with this project from the time that she decided to publish it and champion this work of literature and do so much to learn about Nasser and engage with his family and go to visit them. Um, and, Judith, I wonder if there's anything of the things that we were talking about this evening that you wanted to follow up on, or else share some of your experience with this book.
Well, after this conversation, first of all, thank you so much for having me. Hello, everyone. You guys are so smart. I don't want to mess it up, It's so amazing to hear you. I would let you continue. I would add, there are two little things that always haunts me when we talk about this book. One is, first of all, just en passant, Walid Daka is the uncle of Nadia, of Nana, who is the love of the life of Nasser. So I just wanted to pass that on to you.
That's, yeah.
Let me just, there are two things, sorry about that noise, that I would like to point out. You were talking about the wall and also about the refugee camps. There are usually 2 points that always comes back to me. One is that, sometime, I happen to have a Lacanian psychoanalytic background, and I'm an analyst on the side. And what struck me in this book is the fact that Nasser unknowingly reveals what it means to be human under the worst possible circumstances. But what it means to be human means to how can you continue to somehow cherish what is most important, which is how do you articulate what you want? And you can't do that alone. And the fact that he was able to imagine that the wall was a companion that was hearing him, and somehow he was able to imagine what the wall was sending back to him, is really going back to the absolute foundation of what human nature is, because we human, we depend on the other. We can't live without another. We can't function or talk without another talking back to us. And that starts, with your mother and your father when you're a baby, even after, about maybe a few hours after you're born, some babies are able to look in the eye of the mother and somehow see that they are seen. So that Nasser had the incredible ability to somehow use the trauma that he lived through to find a way to reinvent what it means to be human. To me, that was absolute, in its foundation, that was absolutely extraordinary. So that's one thing that I think that book transcends, the story of the Palestinian also. It's something completely universal. But of course, what is so remarkable about what it means, the word universal, is that we are, thanks to Luke, we are given the opportunity to understand what this universal feeling is about, because the power of translation is really the only thing that really, I would say, capture what the word universal means. And I'm here copying one of my other author and mentor, Suleiman Bashir Dian, who explains that, what universalism is about is to go from one language, to translate one language into another, to translate one culture into another. And because we encounter through Nasser things we don't know and things we know, we learn something more than simply being introduced to his humanity. So there's so many layers there. So that was one thing that I wanted to mention, that we all look so much because of all his hard work and all his effort. He is touching on the nerve of what is universal in the experience of Nasser. On the other side, of course, there is the history of what Palestinian people endure and the horrible reputation they have in the West. So to have this extraordinary man start his book by citing Kierkegaard, who taught him that you have to relinquish the love you have because egoism is not going to work. And I mean, to use Kierkegaard right off the bat. And then when you think of the words about that Israeli use about calling, Palestinian human animals, I mean, now it's a completely different story than when I bought the book. When I was lucky enough to have a friend who is a Palestinian voracious reader to tell me that book is a must, it's a masterpiece. He read it in 24 hours. His name is Khalil Aboudi, and he's a father of a dear friend of mine who's Palestinian. I mean, I understand why he had that reaction. So but when I bought the book, it was what, 22, Luke, when we started working together? That was a whole different story. It wasn't that different, but everything degenerated after that. But it gives you a sense, that when you capture the drama of Palestinian life in 22, and then you see what happened to them now, that's one thing. And the other little thing I wanted to say is how important, and this is something Ammiel mentioned right away about October 7, is how he was critical of the Intifada at the same time at trying to give it a lot of meaning. So what he said, and then I'll stop talking. What he said was, in a refugee camp, children carry their grandparents on their shoulder because they have no sense of past, present, and future, because the life in a refugee camp doesn't give you any sense of hope of what you're going to do next. And to me, he said, the Intifada somehow restore a possibility of hope. Again, we understand that. I mean, we know, all kind of, places where people are revolting to get their freedom and their independence after occupation or colonization. But these little things that he explains so beautifully in the book shows how literature is really at the heart of the political and also of the universal. So these are the two little things I wanted throw in about why that book is so important to us, and how it goes, it delves deep into the history of the Palestinian people, but it also touches on what it means to be human, and what he brings us that gives us a sense of the universal in a way we haven't really understood yet.
Judith, maybe before we go to some questions, could you just maybe say something about your recent or immediate experiences just with, his situation presently, or the family?
Yes, absolutely. That's of course where I should have started. So I'm in close touch with Nadia, who is this lawyer, and also, the main this structure of the wall. In the second part, he says, when you fall in love, the wall is not happy with you anymore, because everything shatters. I spoke to her, and I spoke to other people. So because he's been in prison for all this time, and he was in prison before the Oslo Accord, he should potentially, everything says he should be on the list. Now, he was not on the first round. He may not be on the second, but he should be on the third. That's not Nadia's sense. And I spoke to some other people who are more or less aware of the situation. And of course, she knows best because she's a lawyer. So she felt quite clear that a lot of his friends are going to come sooner. And then she had this image of all his friends out will welcome him when he comes up. I don't know. I'm very superstitious. I don't know. But he fits absolutely all the categories of having to be released. So that's for sure.
Thanks. Do we have some questions? Do you want to check, Luke?
Sure. Maybe the first question from Linda. Do you either have an idea of how other Palestinian prisoners feel about their reality? Is Nasser's view unusual? Of course, every author is unique, or in any way common to others in the prisons. One really interesting thing about this book, he's often interacting with other prisoners and reflecting on these questions. And so I don't have myself experience outside of this book, but I see through Nasser's eyes, there were differences in how people respond to their situation. He talks about certain group of prisoners that are seeing their experience in a very religious light, as part of, using religion as a way to create a narrative that provides justification and understanding for what they're going through. Other times he talks about after the second Intifada in the early 2000s, how he tried to help all this great influx of prisoners coming in. He tried to help share some of the wisdom that he had required over the past 10 to 15 years of how to survive in prison and how to deal with the pain of that. And they really didn't want anything to do with it. They were rejecting his experience and his thoughts. You also see, there's some, touching moments of the bonds that are created between prisoners, or the admiration that prisoners have for others who sacrifice themselves or take on great pain in hunger strikes. But Ammiel, do you have anything else to add on that specific question?
Well, it's a great question. It's a difficult question because there's been enormous changes from, let's say from the 1980s and the 90s into the early 2000s, when prisoners were organized very clearly along party lines, along affiliation, where, prisoners that I met who got out in the big exchange in 1985 were like triple PhDs. They studied, they were the kinds of things that Walid Daka talks about and that Nasser talks about is the internalization of torture, the breaking up of people into individuals and into grouping them according to where they come from and not their. And so I think that the conditions now for imagination are very different than they might have been. And there is, how can I put it? Prison is not just prison in the occupied, in occupied Palestine is not just the experience of the imprisoned, it's everybody's experience. So prison is just a central part of everybody's thinking process of writers' thinking process. It's central. It's just central. Everybody's affected one way or another. Obviously, those who are actually incarcerated are affected differently, but everybody is affected. So it's a complicated question, and I think, you know, part of it, you know, there's a lot of atomization in terms of publishing. Like I have a friend who I'm translating, co-translating, who's in Gaza. His books have been published in Jordan, in Gaza, in Ramallah, and in Algeria. Now, people in any one of those places can't get the other books generally. Okay, so there's a lot of atomization, and it's a very complex question you're asking. So thanks for the question.
Yeah. Maybe we'll come back to William's question in a minute. Mu'tasim asks about, or points out that Nasser does not talk much about his jailers in this book. And that could be a surprise because that's an important part of a person's experience. It comes up a couple places, specifically to the question, have I had the chance to discuss this with Nasser? I haven't. I have, spoken with members of Nasser's family and with Nasser's lawyer on Zoom, but I have not had direct conversations with Nasser or passed this type of question on to him. There are so many things that I would love to ask, and I hope one day to have the chance to do that. In the book, he mentions there's a moving scene that describes his confession and the disorientation psychologically, going from being abused and beaten to being given cigarettes and a cup of coffee and invited to take your time as you're writing out a statement, and to have another cup of coffee and start again when you're ready. There's another scene where he's talking about the sense of disgust that he feels from when he's first imprisoned and how long it is before he can wash, and the way he's made to feel about his dignity because of how he smells and the way that he's seen in the eyes of his captors. And then we see some of the soldier jailers taking a baby away from a mother. But for the most part, that's not what this book is about. It's about the Palestinian struggle. It's about his experience trying to make sense of life in prison. He talks about trying to live with the people of the sky, or the language of the sky, trying to elevate and rise above his bonds there. I don't know, Ammiel, if you have any other reflections on his,
No,
past.
I think I think he's intentionally making them insignificant. I mean, this story, this story is the story of the wall and how he is struggling to maintain equilibrium, sanity, and freedom within the freedom of mind and spirit within the situation that he's in. And so I think that everything else, in a strange way, is secondary to that. And so when you said, Judith, about this idea of the other, the other is also his memory and his continual going over, gestures and things that he remembers with his parents, with his friends, um, I think that's very much, it's an interrogation of his own life too. So yeah. The other thing I think, I don't know if people are aware of, but I mean, just as a quick fact, I mean, there's no legal system. It's a military occupation. I mean, there's no, you know, confessions are done under torture. If somebody is caught doing something, they're usually killed on the spot or disabled, maimed, or something. And they also just round up people without charges. So there's now 10,000 prisoners that have been rounded up since more, 12 or 13,000 maybe. So those people are really in a hostage situation. They've just been picked up no charges, administrative detention that can be repeated ad infinitum. And so, I've attended those military tribunals, and they're not legal. There's no there's no there's no legal norm involved.
William asks, can you place the Tale of a Wall in the context of the burgeoning genre of prison literature? And what does it say about the nature of writing itself?
Can we is unique in relation to the person who writes it? Of course, in the context of where they write. I don't know. I mean, you're the big expert on prison literature, Ammiel, but to me,
No, I'm not at all. I'm not at all. But really, I'm not. But I think the modern Arabic literature is founded on prison literature. The first important modern novel, The Smell of It by Sanala Ibrahim, is a prison novel, and the situation of writing in the contemporary Arab world has got a lot to do with prison, and likewise in Palestine. So it's very much it's not simply prison itself. It's what it stands for. It's everything else that makes the prison this inevitable,
important.
way station for people. I mean, I think of the letters of George Jackson sometimes in reading some of these things. I mean, George Jackson had a real constraint in that he had a piece of paper that was a certain dimension, and that was all he could write on. And so some people, I said, there's a next question about Faraj Bayraktar, who actually is doing very well and will be coming to the US in March, hopefully. Faraj, many of his poems were not written, they were memorized by prisoners who were leaving. And, this is kind of like an, Akhmatova or Mandelstam situation in the Soviet Union. And then others were written on cigarette papers, with tea, and smuggled out. So there are all kinds of, constraints, shall we say.
Another thing, I just want to quickly add that it's so interesting, you're going to read the books, hopefully all of you are so kind to come now. And it's so interesting, the experience you're going to have now compared to the experience I had when Luke was translating. So, it's always the same thing with the book. It speaks differently. So you reread it, you read it now, you read it then. So every time it's a different book, because as Ammiel just said, the context and what the place of the prison in the society in which it's been created. I don't know if it has dramatically changed, but it has certainly been exposed in a very different way.
Yeah. I'm thrilled that we have a couple of tremendous translators who are asking us questions. We have Margaret Litvin and Alex Zalens, and there may be others that I don't know, but maybe Margaret's. That's a wonderful question.
Sure. Margaret, hi, Margaret. Could you comment on the role of beauty in this book, both in Nasser's life, in the person of Nana, and in the prose itself? It's a great question to reflect on. And not one that I thought directly about or in this way before. Maybe I'll comment. Ammiel was mentioning earlier his experience of Nana, the character of Nana, and his sense that this was an expression of something, not something that was happening, but a way to tell us something about Nasser's experience in prison, or his imagination of prison, or how he was surviving prison by creating this sense of a character. And that was how I read the character as well, especially with all of the dialogue that we have and the letters. Epistolary novels are a genre that I thought Nasser was invoking. And then I spoke to Nasser's niece, and he said, no, absolutely, this is a real person, and she believes that all those letters are the exact ones that Nasser received. And I said, well, what about the conversation? She said, no, my uncle has a very good memory. And so she thinks it's kind of a transcription. And I'm not so sure still, as as I think back. And that's one question that I'd love to ask Nasser about and get some more information. But he create, he romantic love is something that's denied Nasser for all of these years. And the there's a sense of fantasy and imagining, and that's something that he alludes to and talks about as a way to get through um, that isolation and deprivation. Um, and the kind of the idea of, he talks about when he's being tortured with loud music, he turns that into loud classical music that's being played at disruptive times of the day. And he is able to pretend that he's dancing with the most beautiful women. And, he has different dancing partners and they're wearing different costumes. But, coming back to the question of the language as well, you ask about the beauty of the language. Reviewers have commented on the lyrical style of the prose. And that definitely comes through in various places, not all the time, but many sections are. Nasser builds images that evokes these ideas. Not saying this very articulately, but it's definitely an important part of the book that he is experiencing beauty and trying to express it from his perspective where he is.
Yeah. And there's Alex's question.
Sure. While working on this translation, were you drawing on other examples of prison literature, Arab or otherwise? Not explicitly. There are things that I've read maybe in the distant past that come in. But I think a lot of it was about both maybe research into what was happening in the Israeli prisons, and then trying to combine that with my interpretation of the language to really capture the power of what he's saying, try to capture that in English.
I was struck by there's a phrase that comes up a number of times: hold fast, hold fast. And that's the famous, I mean, I don't know if this was at all in your mind, but it's interesting. It just came up almost like as an archetype. The famous poem by Abdul Latif Al-Abi, which was many prisoners memorized, and it was Tien, hold fast, hold fast. To, it was like a mantra almost. People going through torture, just hold fast. Yeah.
The yeah, that word, this the concept of holding fast and relinquishing. There are a number of ways you could say that and make that pairing. Letting go, and sometimes maybe I might vary it a little bit in English, even if it's the same word in Arabic. But that was one phrase that I came back to and maybe took a couple different shots at. I have a I I'm a sailor. That's my other passion, and there's this sailor's tattoo. The tattoo hold fast across the knuckles that helps with the idea that will help sailors hold onto the rigging in a storm, not let go. And so I think that was part of my
That's interesting.
how that came into my translation. Um, um, on that topic, Jordan asks, was that another way of describing sumud, hold fast, this patient endurance? I don't remember offhand if that term is in the book. So that's not the specific term here, but that's a great question. I'm curious. Jamila asks if there's a moment when I ever lamented not being able to ask Nasser something. And it's interesting that translators sometimes talk about whether they translate living authors or deceased authors, and some of the benefits and also sometimes challenges of working with authors who are alive, and you can consult, and they can take part in different ways in the translation. I think I mentioned the one about asking more about Nana. Another one, Judith and I have talked about this, of just how widely read Nasser is and how humane in so many, and um, funny and emotional. I think it'd just be wonderful to have a dinner with him and spend time with a person like this. But a specific question that I um, would want to ask him is, the decisions, the editing, some of the decisions that I made in some of the places where we compressed the text a little bit, or cut a paragraph or a sentence here or there. Um, is he comfortable with that decision? And overall, he gave his blessing to send that back, but it wasn't the same as being able to work with somebody. And for somebody whose voice has been so constricted, and so much has been taken away from him, the idea of getting that wrong or not fully capturing him or presenting him is something that weighed upon me as a translator, and that was really difficult. So that, I think, would be one of my top priorities to talk with him about.
And one comment that I think hasn't come up, which struck me, that maybe people wouldn't think of, but I mean, in one way it's obvious, in another way it isn't so obvious. But the book, in many ways, there are a lot of parts of the book that feel highly encoded to me, and I think that's obvious to me as somebody in that situation, even though they are imprisoned, are still in danger, you know, in all kinds of ways, both him towards himself, what he might be thinking, and how he expresses things and what he expresses, both politically and otherwise. And so I think that's something to keep in mind, that it's not a question of self-censorship. It's a question of finding ways to say things that are allusions, that are creating a language. And that's part of how he describes himself, with it being of the generation of stones. It's a new alphabet, an alphabet coming out of the camp. It's learning a new alphabet, the generation of stones. And it's like what Yahya Sinwar said, those stones became words, but that's all we had were stones. And so I think keeping that in mind is useful, because it is a lot of astute political analysis in here that's going on. And it's quite, one in that situation is going to maybe not be absolutely direct about certain things.
It's interesting you say that, because in Arabic, it was called a novel. And we had a lot of debate about not calling it a novel because
Right.
it's so real. So, and the category of autofiction doesn't exist in publishing. So it was really a tough decision for us.
Yeah.
That we didn't want to betray. I mean, to me, to call it a novel wasn't fair to him also.
Yeah. No, it's not a novel. It's not a novel.
There's one last question in the text, and maybe that's the last we have time for tonight. How did you get hold of the text, Luke? Is there a story there? Um, yes, there is a story. And maybe not all of it on, following up on the previous comments, not all of it comfortable to say here about the process of getting a text out of prison, and what, Nasser had to do for that. We've heard some descriptions of that, not directly from Nasser, but from people in his life. And it's a remarkable story about, what does one, first of all, produce, this complex text and then transmit it to the outside world. And I think, some of the stages along the way, it's not something that Nasser had the opportunity to work closely with an editor on, or it's not clear how firm the text was, or is this the exact form of the text that he would have produced had he had all the time and freedom um, that we would have liked. But the how it came to me was as a translator. Maybe it was the first or one of the very first times when a publisher has approached me, somebody, which was very meaningful. And I am so grateful that I was in the right place at the right time. And Judith and I, the publisher, we actually live about a 10-minute bicycle ride away. And so when we were working on this book, I was able to go and sit and read together and kind of edit together and get immediate feedback on um, how the work was reaching a reader and how somebody else was hearing it. But Judith, is there anything more that you'd want to say about the how you became involved and why you chose this book? And
Well, I mean, I don't know if I mean, I have to say, as a Jew, I feel I'm very much, I don't do as much as Ammiel, but I'm aligned as much as I possibly can. And I felt that to have this extraordinary opportunity, the story came up because nobody was approaching me with Palestinian work. And I was lucky enough to ask a friend of mine who is an agent in Paris, his name is Pierre Astier, why he sells a lot of wonderful North African and African literature. And he didn't have a Palestinian book in his list, and he was very upset about it. And he contacted one of his friends who has been instrumental, whose name is Olivia Snay, and she found the book because she was friends with the publisher in Lebanon. And then I was lucky enough to have a friend who is passionate about literature and who has read many, many of my books. And he read it and told me I had no choice. So it was a serendipity, but my heart was in there from the very beginning, because I think it's our job, to do everything we can, especially, if you have a Jewish heritage, you can't possibly let this happen without screaming and doing as much as you possibly can. And my other dream was that maybe, but I don't want to say that I'm too superstitious, but I had this fantasy that maybe Nasser could join us on Zoom. I had that fantasy after the.
I would just mention as another example, there was mentioned several times of Faraj Bayraktar, but when the manuscript of his that we had, the book that we had of his, was published without his knowledge while he was still in prison, and it was used as a means of creating, a movement around him to free him. And when he found out about it, he was very nervous because he thought that his visitation rights with his family would be cut off, and and it took him, it was hard for him to deal with that, and to know that this book was circulating, and that he thought that it might bring further constraints on him. So it's a complex problem to deal with, and those of us who are working with this material really have to be, like you said, Luke, in your preface, beyond responsible. I mean, I appreciate that you said that in your preface, how the responsibility you felt getting this text, it's very important to point that out.
yes. Well, thank you so much for this time.
I would just say one last thing that I think that, and I'm sure you feel this way, just because I can tell from the function of a book like this. It's not to help the author, to help the imprisoned person. It's a challenge to us. It's a challenge to us. It's a challenge to complacency. It's a challenge to American writers to wake up, and to see something like this and respond. So I think that's I certainly feel Judith and Luke, you did that in this spirit, which is really important to keep in mind.